So the Ska-opper, this is a pretty sweet fly. It looks a little bit like a gurgler, even a mouse. How does that, how do you fish it? And especially for steelhead, obviously.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of a gurgling type pattern. I mean, I originally I called it the steelhead popper because I actually pop it as it's fished around. And when we went to market the thing, it was something that George Cook didn't feel like people would buy a steelhead popper because people weren't familiar with popping steelhead flies at the time. So, he renamed it the Ska-opper, S-K-A, for skater. So it could be a skater, and then the opper for the popper. And now people are growing more accustomed to popping or twitching or gurgling steelhead flies. So the name's kind of stuck. But yeah, as the flies swung around, we do fish it on a tight line the same way you would a regular, skated fly. But as the fly is being swung around, you actually kind of twitch it with your rod tip, giving it a little kind of a pop. And that's why that's why I call it more of a. It does, yeah. I call it more of a popping than a gurgling. Because a gurgling, you just kind of envision this fly gurgling. This is actually an explosive type, blam, blam, blam. And real heavy water. We're actually trying to pop the thing as much as you can to make as big a disturbance as you possibly can.
How did you come up with that idea? How did you get them, to get those fish to react to that?
Actually, the first poppers I ever fished were intruder poppers, and they were honestly this big. And we were, fishing in northern BC. I fished around a lot of gear guys, and kind of the traditional way for those guys to fish up there is they fish a lot of single action Silex type reels with big dink floats. And with the single action reel, they're not a multiplier type reel. So as they retrieve their gear back, that big black dink float, this big bobber, would kind of chug across the top as they bring them to make this kind of popping action as they reel back. And I just, being around those guys, I couldn't believe how many fish were actually, whacking the float. I mean, they were crushing that thing. So it didn't take too long before, I was trying to match the dink float hatch. I mean, it was just an instant kind of a deal for me. So, the very first poppers I ever fished were these kind of big black, with an orange head, like a dink float. I mean, just in my mind, that's what I had, and actually the very first tailhead I ever went to, I got one on one of those big things. But at the time, the very first ones I ever did was I was throwing it out and I was kind of actually popping it back the same way, you would a bass pop or something. I was actually stripping it in. But for us, or steelheaders, we actually enjoy throwing it out and swinging a tight line, and that's how we enjoy fishing. But, it never really connected to it, just the kind of popping action until I made my way back to the mainland, and where the conditions were really, really cold. And then all of a sudden stripping line didn't become an option because it just freezing your guides. So then we started chugging these things. And kind of the same kind of action we were doing with our
When did you decide to downsize it? You said, you were doing ones to replicate.
Yeah, when I actually, I came back to the North Umpqua where I grew up on the Rogue and fishing the Rogue in the North and Southern Oregon. And, growing up on the Rogue, twitching flies was a big part of, what steelhead fishing was back then. Actually, fly fishing for steelhead, kind of through the 50s and 60s on the Rogue River was actually being in a drift boat, holding onto a fly rod, twitching, a girdle bug or whatever you had on. I mean, that just was a red ant or whatever you're doing. That's kind of what fly fishing was on the Rogue there for a long time. And so I kind of grew up with this twitching. But actually coming back to the North Umpqua and seeing what a group of guys, Tony Ratney and a group of guys, they were doing there, they were twitching these. He actually calls it a little twitcher. It's the same kind of idea. It's a little twitching fly, and it didn't take long. I saw them doing that, and it just instantly, the transition into kind of some of the first ones I were kind of the very first one I ever threw on the North Umpqua was one of my big northern poppers, and obviously it didn't take too long before in that clear water before it was downsizing, and then they've continued to downsize since then. I mean, the poppers I'm fishing now are quite a bit smaller than I was even fishing maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So.
What depth of water are you looking for that the fish will kind of come up to that?
Yeah, how far will they move?
Yeah, it's kind of river specific. Yeah. I mean, on the Rogue, I catch them on the Rogue with it. I don't feel like I can feel them. I feel like I can bring those fish as far. I think part of it's with the water clarity too. The Rogue's not real clear, and you start getting in much more than 6 foot of water, and all of a sudden I don't think it's quite the obtrusive kind of critter on top the way it is when it's really clear. With the North Umpqua, you can see for miles. Yeah. And I think even in 10, 12 foot of water, this fly up there making a disturbance is, pretty obtrusive intruder.
What's the reaction like? I mean, I've only traditionally, nymph fished and, swung traditionally for steel, but I've never caught a steelhead on even skating a fly. What's the reaction like on a Ska-opper?
I think that's the most exciting part about it for me, because I never really enjoyed fishing the dry fly. I mean, I was a sunk fly fisherman. I mean, you see these big intruders. I love fishing. I love that big pull. I mean, that's what it was all about for me, is feeling that big yank. And just this subtle trouty kind of dimple never really kind of excited me. So a lot of the dry fly fishing I had done with little hitched flies and whatnot, especially say like on the Deschutes and stuff, where they were mostly really subtle type rises. It never really, didn't turn my crank for me. So that's the exciting thing about these. Is something about it is it triggers that kind of, once again, that predatory kind of kill response, and it's amazing. The tikes. It's not a subtle trout rise at all. There's no trout instincts. It is like, I'm going to kill that thing, you know. And a lot of the guys I fish that are, you know, got a lot of bass fishing, like, man, that thing, you ate that thing just like a bass. I'm like, yeah, man. I mean, they come completely out of the water sometimes for us.
I usually, I mean, if chugging and stuff like that, I have a tendency to pull the fly right out of the fish's mouth. I mean, do you wait on it when that thing hits it, or?
I do, but I feel that's the case with just about any dry fly, because I still, I mean, to say that this is all I ever fish, I mean, you know, I mean, I still do fish some traditional. I mean, I'll skate a muddler a lot, you know, a hitched muddler, and still get fish to come to that. So this isn't the end all be all of dry fly fishing. I never want to even try to make that point, but even fishing a more standard type dry fly. I want to feel the weight of the fish. I think that's really, really key is to let the fish actually come to the fly, let them take it, let them turn with the fly, let them place the hook. I think that's important just about any of the steelhead flies, aside from nymphing. Yeah. But any of the kind of swung type patterns, it's really important to let the fish take the fly, turn, let them place the hook somewhere in their mouth. If you're jerking, trying to place the hook, most of the time you're going to pull out. So let the hook find some meat. Once it's found some meat and the fish is kind of pulled into the hook. I mean, I do have people lift into the fly pretty hard. I don't have my clients just kind of barely lift the rod. Once the weight's there, I do have them kind of lean into it a bit.
It's so hard to weight.
Yeah, it is. and you know, it's the thing about the dry fly is because so many times, even with the skated dry, and rather the poppers, is that they will show themselves on the fly over and over and over again before they actually take it. And if you do that, you know, it's kind of that do as I say, not as I do, because I jerk it away myself. But it's, you know, if you do let the fly just fish, and let the fish come to the fly over and over and over again. Maybe 3 or 4, 5, 6, 10 casts later, they finally do commit. But more times than not, if you do kind of jerk and pull the fly away from its game over.
Everybody always seems to ask the question, how do you land a steelhead with one of these long rods? What I like to do is bring them in the shallows. Obviously don't want to drag them up on the rocks where we hurt them and wipe the slime off them. So just try to keep my rod as low as I can. Get them in here where it's fairly slow. And about the time I kind of feel like he's calmed down, I just let some line slip in my hand. I grab my leader and I try to lift his head up. Lead him right in. Keep his head from banging on the rocks. And there we go, we got him. Nice, beautiful wild buck. Beautiful fish. Gorgeous buck, man. Nice wild fish. Did he fly or what, man? He flew. Absolutely flew. So when you go to release one, kind of get her out there in walking speed type current. Face their head upstream so the water can run through their gills. Just let them rest here a bit. You'll know when they're ready to go. Just kind of hold them and support them and let them breathe. And this one put on quite a show. I think he's pretty tired. There he's kicking.